The sun was just beginning to set as Captain Marcus Williams, a seasoned pilot, arrived at the airline's headquarters. He had been flying for over 15 years and had earned every badge of respect in the aviation industry. With his dark uniform and polished shoes, he looked every bit the part of an experienced pilot. He was used to the occasional attention that came with his career. After all, being a pilot came with some level of recognition. But today, he wasn't just there for a routine flight or a briefing. Marcus was scheduled to meet with senior airline staff for a special discussion, one that he had been preparing for all week. He was looking forward to this opportunity, knowing that it could be a step forward for his career. He walked into the airline's headquarters confidently, his face calm and collected, masking any nerves he might have felt inside. The building was sleek and modern, and the staff at the front desk had seen many pilots pass through. Marcus greeted the receptionist, who smiled back and acknowledged him. "How can I help you today?" she asked politely. "I'm here for my meeting with the senior team," Marcus replied, offering a warm smile in return. He had been in this exact situation before, walking into an office to meet with company leadership, so it was nothing out of the ordinary. He was familiar with the drill, but today would be different. The receptionist's smile faded for just a moment, and she glanced down at the computer screen in front of her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she searched for his name. After a brief moment of silence, she looked up at Marcus with a puzzled expression. "I'm sorry, but it looks like there's been a mix-up," she said, her tone slightly uncertain. "You're not listed for any meetings today. You'll need to wait outside." Marcus was taken aback. "Wait outside? But I was confirmed for this meeting. I've got everything scheduled, and I've cleared my day for this." "I'm sorry, sir," the receptionist repeated. "There's nothing here for you. I can have someone come speak with you in a moment, but please wait outside for now." A rush of confusion surged through Marcus. He had been planning this meeting for days. His mind raced, but he didn't want to appear flustered. He had been in high-stakes situations before, but this felt different, unexpected. In all his years of working in the airline industry, he had never been treated like this. A sense of disbelief started to creep in, but he quickly masked it. Marcus walked away from the desk, his shoes clicking sharply against the floor as he made his way to the waiting area. He could feel the eyes of the staff on him, but there was no need to acknowledge them. Instead, he took a seat, choosing to wait patiently for whatever would come next. As he sat there, his thoughts began to swirl. For years, Marcus had encountered small moments of disrespect, those little things that others might not even notice, like the hesitation in someone's voice when they asked him for identification, or the uncertainty in their eyes when they looked at him, wondering if he truly belonged in such a position. But he had always risen above it. He had pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the job. He had earned his place, no matter how others may have tried to make him feel. Today, however, it was different. Today, he was the one being told to wait outside. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus thought about how often he had been made to feel invisible in his career. He knew it was due to his race, subtle biases that no one wanted to openly admit, but ones that were felt nonetheless. He had worked harder than most to prove himself, often having to go above and beyond to show that he was just as qualified, just as capable, and just as dedicated as any of his colleagues. But now, in this very moment, it felt as though all of that didn't matter. It was like he was being reduced to nothing more than a face in the crowd, a nameless figure with no importance. But Marcus wasn't the type to let things slide. No, he wasn't one to bow his head in defeat. He knew this moment, however small it seemed, could be the spark for something greater. He was determined not to let this pass by without taking action. He wasn't going to simply accept being ignored and pushed aside. He had fought for too long to earn respect in this industry. He took a deep breath and tried to calm his nerves, pushing aside the feelings of frustration building up inside him. He reminded himself that he had been through worse. He had flown in some of the most difficult conditions imaginable. He had faced challenges that made this moment seem trivial in comparison. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong here. It wasn't just about this one incident. It was about the larger picture. It was about the way his race seemed to always be a barrier, even in a space where he had already proven himself time and time again. Marcus stood up, his decision already made. He wasn't going to sit here in silence any longer. He would do something about this. This moment, though frustrating and unexpected, would not define him. Instead, it would become the catalyst for the change he had always dreamed of. As he made his way out of the waiting area, he couldn't help but wonder how long this kind of treatment would continue. How many others had been through the same thing and had just accepted it. Today, that was all about to change. Marcus sat in the waiting area, his mind racing with thoughts and emotions. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as he replayed the events over and over in his head. He couldn't shake the feeling of being overlooked, of being treated differently because of the color of his skin. He had worked so hard to get where he was, and yet here he was again, being dismissed, made to feel small, like his accomplishments didn't matter. But despite the frustration building inside him, Marcus knew he couldn't let this moment define him. He had been through much worse in his career. He had flown in storms that would make others tremble, faced emergencies where seconds meant the difference between life and death. He had been through the most grueling training programs, passed every test, and proved himself time and again. His accomplishments spoke for themselves, and yet somehow it was still not enough for some people. It was always going to be like this, wasn't it? He wasn't just a pilot to some people. He was the black pilot, the one who didn't quite fit into their ideal of what a real pilot should look like. The sting of that realization was sharp, but Marcus didn't let it consume him. He had faced challenges like this before, and he knew how to deal with them. This time, however, something felt different. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about the way he was treated. It was about something bigger, something that went beyond his personal experience. It was about all the people who had been treated this way, who had been brushed aside because of who they were. The countless others who had been overlooked, underestimated, or ignored. For them, Marcus knew, this moment could be something more. He couldn't just sit back and let it slide. He had to do something. As he looked around the room, he saw other employees walking past, completely unaware of the storm brewing in his mind. The staff members were busy, focused on their work, but Marcus couldn't help but feel like a stranger in their world. A world where his presence wasn't fully acknowledged. The feeling of being invisible was something he had learned to live with, but today it stung more than usual. He stood up, the decision clear in his mind. He wouldn't allow this to go unnoticed. He had fought too hard for his place in the industry to be brushed aside like this. He needed to speak up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had faced this kind of discrimination, whether subtle or overt. Marcus stepped toward the receptionist's desk. She looked up at him in surprise, no doubt thinking he was about to voice his frustration, but he didn't. Instead, he kept his tone calm, his words measured. "I need to speak with someone about this situation. I've been waiting here for a long time now, and I don't understand why I was treated like this." The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard once again. She clearly didn't know how to handle the situation. After a long pause, she finally said, "I'm sorry for the confusion, but I'll let someone know about your concerns." As she spoke, Marcus didn't feel any comfort from her words. He knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't simply a mistake. It was part of a much larger issue that had been happening for far too long, and he wasn't going to let it slip away unnoticed. He didn't want an apology. He wanted change. The thought of what might be happening behind closed doors in the company troubled him. How many people had experienced similar treatment? How many had been told to wait outside or dismissed without a second thought? He wasn't just angry at the way he was treated. He was angry at the system that allowed it to happen. A system that made him feel like his worth was always in question. Marcus wasn't about to let this go. He couldn't. Instead of sitting back down, he made a decision. He walked away from the reception area, heading toward the office of the airline's senior leadership. He knew it was a bold move, but it was the only way to make an impact. He wasn't going to let this slide any longer. He had to speak to the people who could make a real change, who could ensure this didn't happen to anyone else again. As he walked through the hallway, his steps purposeful and determined, he reflected on all the years he had spent proving himself. He had done everything the right way, yet it still wasn't enough. It was frustrating, but Marcus didn't let frustration turn into defeat. He knew that sometimes, to change the world, you had to make people uncomfortable. You had to challenge the status quo. When he reached the door to the office, he paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. He wasn't nervous, but the weight of what he was about to do hit him. This wasn't just about one person or one situation. It was about taking a stand for the countless others who had faced similar injustices. He wasn't just representing himself. He was representing everyone who had been dismissed, ignored, or overlooked. With a steady hand, Marcus knocked on the door. The door opened almost immediately, and the senior manager stood there, looking at him with surprise. The expression on his face quickly turned to one of confusion. "Can I help you?" the manager asked, glancing at Marcus and then down the hallway, clearly unsure of why he had come. Marcus didn't waste any time. He looked the manager in the eye and said, "I've been waiting outside for far too long. I'm here because I need to discuss how this company treats its employees, especially those of us who don't always fit the mold. I was told to wait outside earlier today, and I've had enough." The senior manager's face turned pale. He wasn't prepared for this confrontation. Marcus could see it in his eyes. He wasn't ready for someone to stand up and speak out, and it caught him off guard. But Marcus wasn't about to back down. He was finally ready to face the issue head-on. The conversation wasn't just about one pilot. It was about changing the narrative for everyone. The senior manager blinked a few times, clearly caught off guard by Marcus's directness. For a brief moment, he seemed unsure how to respond. He glanced around, possibly trying to assess the situation, but Marcus wasn't going to give him that luxury. Marcus's posture remained firm, standing tall in front of the door. The manager cleared his throat, his voice shaky, as he finally spoke. I'm not sure what you're referring to," the manager stammered, trying to mask his discomfort. "I wasn't informed that you were here for any specific reason." Marcus took a step forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "I've been flying for years. I've worked hard. I've earned my position, and I've had the chance to prove myself countless times. But you need to understand that this is bigger than just me. It's not about this one meeting. It's about how I've been treated by this company. And it's about how people like me are treated in this industry. I've been dismissed, ignored, and made to feel invisible. And I'm not going to sit back and accept it any longer." The manager's face softened slightly, though Marcus could see the uncertainty still lingering in his eyes. He wasn't used to being confronted like this. He wasn't prepared to face someone with the courage to speak up so confidently. But Marcus wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. He had made a decision that day to stand tall, to speak out for himself, and for the countless others who had faced similar treatment. "Look, I'm sorry if you feel like there's been a misunderstanding," the manager began again, his voice slightly defensive. "But we do things by the book here. We follow the procedures, and sometimes things don't go as planned. I don't think there's any malice behind it." Marcus shook his head, not buying the explanation. "It's not just about procedures or mistakes. It's about how I was made to feel from the moment I walked in. I was treated like I didn't belong, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. This happens all the time, doesn't it? People don't realize the impact of these small actions, these little moments where someone is treated as less than or told to wait outside without explanation. You may not see it, but it builds up. It adds up over time." The manager shifted uncomfortably on his feet, clearly processing Marcus's words. The room felt heavy with the weight of the conversation, but Marcus wasn't backing down. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the chance to make the company, the industry, and the people around him understand that these issues were real. They were not just small inconveniences or misunderstandings. They were part of a larger problem that needed to be addressed. It's not just about one person or one incident, Marcus continued. It's about systemic issues. It's about the ways people are treated based on things they can't control. Things like the color of their skin, the way they speak, or the way they look. And it's about how these issues are ignored or swept under the rug, as if they don't matter. They do matter. They matter to me. And they matter to everyone who has been made to feel less than. The manager seemed to soften a little more, but he was still hesitant. He had never had this kind of conversation with someone before. He had heard about diversity training, read the reports, and attended meetings. But it was different when someone was standing right in front of him, calling attention to the things that most people were too uncomfortable to discuss openly. "I hear what you're saying, and I understand that you feel hurt," the manager said slowly, his tone softer now. "I'll admit that maybe we haven't handled things as well as we could have. But this isn't something we take lightly. We're working on improving things, on making sure everyone feels respected and valued. It's not perfect, but we're trying." Marcus studied the manager's face, looking for any sign that he truly understood. He wanted to believe him, wanted to think that the company would take responsibility and make changes. But Marcus had been through enough to know that words alone weren't enough. Action was what mattered, and that was something the company would need to prove. "I'm not asking for your apology, and I'm not asking for your sympathy," Marcus said, his voice steady. "What I'm asking for is change. Real change. It's not enough to say you're working on it. You have to show it. You have to take real steps to make sure this doesn't happen again. I don't want another pilot, another employee, to walk in and feel like they don't belong, like they're invisible." There was a long silence between them, as the weight of Marcus's words hung in the air. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but for a moment, no sound came out. It was as though the reality of the situation had finally sunk in. He realized this wasn't just about one person or one mistake. It was about a much larger issue that affected many others. "You're right," the manager said quietly after a moment. "We have a long way to go. I can't promise you that everything will be fixed overnight, but I can promise you that I'll take your words seriously. We'll start looking at the way we handle these situations. I'll make sure your concerns get to the right people." Marcus nodded, though he knew this was just the beginning. It wasn't enough to hear promises. It was about seeing those promises put into action. He wasn't expecting immediate results, but he hoped that this conversation would be the spark that started something bigger. As Marcus turned to leave the manager's office, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him felt hopeful that this was the first step toward real change. Another part of him, though, knew that the fight was far from over. It would take time, effort, and courage from everyone involved to make the lasting change that was needed. But Marcus had made his stand, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. Marcus walked out of the senior manager's office, his heart still racing from the intensity of the conversation. The weight of what he had just said hung heavy in the air, but there was also a sense of determination that he hadn't felt before. He knew that he had just started something that could shake the very foundation of how the airline, and possibly the whole industry, operated. But Marcus wasn't one to get carried away with hope. He was cautious, and he knew that words alone wouldn't make the change he wanted to see. It was the actions that followed that mattered. As he walked down the hall, his thoughts began to clear. He thought about what had led to this moment, what had made him decide to stand up in the first place. It wasn't just about his treatment that day, though that was certainly a part of it. It was about something deeper, something that had been building in him for years. He had spent so much of his career trying to rise above the subtle prejudice that had followed him. It wasn't easy. It never was. And it wasn't just in the airline industry. It was everywhere. It was in the way people looked at him when he stepped onto a plane, in the way his accomplishments were sometimes dismissed because they didn't fit the image of what others thought a pilot should look like. He had spent so much time trying to prove himself, to show that he was just as qualified as anyone else. But the truth was, that shouldn't have been the case. His qualifications should have been enough, his experience enough, without having to prove anything further. And it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had faced the same bias, who had been overlooked or underestimated, simply because of the way they looked or the color of their skin. He thought about the people he had met over the years, his colleagues, students, and fellow pilots. So many of them had stories of their own, stories of frustration and moments when they had been dismissed or treated unfairly. He knew that they, too, had carried the weight of injustice with them. And that weight was something that had to be acknowledged, something that couldn't be ignored any longer. As Marcus walked through the lobby, he could see the staff members at the front desk glancing up at him. He had walked past them earlier, only to be dismissed and told to wait outside. But now he felt different. His resolve was stronger. He wasn't walking through this space as a victim anymore. He was walking through as someone who had stood up for himself, and he knew that what he had just done would have an impact. The receptionist didn't smile at him this time, but Marcus didn't care. He wasn't expecting her to. He wasn't doing this for recognition or praise. He was doing it for something much bigger. He sat down in the lobby area for a few minutes, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He needed to plan his next steps. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. The wheels had been set in motion, but he would need help to keep them turning. He would need to make sure that the issues he had raised were addressed, that this moment of confrontation wouldn't fade away into nothing. It needed to be part of something larger, something that would hold people accountable for their actions and force the company to change in meaningful ways. In that moment, Marcus realized that he couldn't do this alone. He had already spoken up, but now he needed to make sure that his voice was heard. And to do that, he needed the support of others. He pulled out his phone and made a few quick calls. The first one was to his friend, a journalist he had known for years. They had talked before about the issues of discrimination in the industry, and Marcus knew that now was the time to make his voice heard through the media. "Hey, it's Marcus," he said when the phone picked up. "I need you to listen to this." He quickly explained what had happened at the airline, detailing the incident and how he had been treated. The journalist listened intently, asking a few questions to clarify the details. When Marcus finished, the journalist responded with a quiet but firm voice. "This is big, Marcus. This could make waves. We'll get the story out there. People need to hear about this." Marcus felt a small sense of relief wash over him. The conversation was starting to feel like the beginning of something bigger, something that could lead to real change. But it still wasn't enough. The story needed to be told, but it also needed to be backed up by action. He couldn't afford to let the company or the people involved slip through the cracks. They needed to be held accountable. After hanging up with the journalist, Marcus made a few more calls, reaching out to colleagues who were familiar with the systemic issues that often plagued the airline industry. He knew that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was part of a larger pattern, and it would take a collective effort to bring about meaningful change. The more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized how much work still needed to be done. But he wasn't discouraged. If anything, he felt more determined than ever. He had made his stand, but now he had to ensure that his actions didn't go unnoticed. He needed to keep pushing forward, to keep fighting for the respect and equality that he, and so many others, deserved. As he left the airline headquarters later that evening, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. He had taken a difficult step, but he knew that it was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but it was a road he was ready to walk, and as he stepped out into the cool night air, he felt more certain than ever that he was on the right path. The change he wanted to see in the industry was within reach, and he wasn't going to stop until he had done everything in his power to make it happen. The next few days were a whirlwind for Marcus. After the conversation with the senior manager, he felt both a sense of accomplishment and a deep, quiet urgency to keep moving forward. He had started something, and now he needed to ensure it didn't fizzle out. The media, after all, could only do so much on its own. He needed to build momentum and make sure that the story stayed in the spotlight. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about changing the system. Marcus knew that wasn't going to happen overnight, but he also knew that a single spark could set off a larger fire of change. The journalist he'd spoken with earlier was quick to act. Within a few days, an article appeared online detailing the story of Marcus's experience at the airline. The headline was straightforward but powerful. Pilot rejected and told to wait outside. What happened next will surprise you. The article quickly gained traction, shared by people across social media and news outlets. It was a story that many could relate to, a story that exposed not just one instance of mistreatment, but a larger issue that had been swept under the rug for too long. Marcus hadn't expected the article to blow up as quickly as it did, but it was clear that the public was ready for a conversation about bias in the workplace, particularly in industries that prided themselves on professionalism and excellence. The outrage was immediate. Comment sections on social media platforms were filled with people sharing their own stories of discrimination, many of whom worked in the airline industry or had experienced similar treatment in other sectors. In a way, Marcus's phone began to ring nonstop. Messages from old friends, colleagues, and even strangers flooded in, all expressing support for what he had done. Some of them were pilots, others were flight attendants, and a few were even managers and executives from within the airline world. They all had similar stories to share, and many were grateful that someone had finally spoken up. The response was overwhelmingly positive, but there were also the inevitable few who dismissed the story, claiming it was blown out of proportion or simply a misunderstanding. But Marcus didn't let the negativity bother him. What mattered most was that the conversation had started. It didn't take long for the airline to issue a public statement. They expressed regret over the situation, promising that they would launch an internal review to address the issues that Marcus had raised. But Marcus wasn't fooled. He had seen how companies responded in the past. Empty words, vague promises, and he wasn't about to let this slip away as just another corporate apology. He needed to ensure that this didn't become a meaningless gesture. Marcus met with a few colleagues, people who shared his concerns and were equally motivated to see change happen. Together, they began discussing the next steps. They couldn't afford to wait for the airline's promises to materialize on their own. They needed to be proactive, to push for real, actionable changes. Marcus reached out to a lawyer friend who had worked with companies on diversity and inclusion initiatives. With her help, they began to strategize, to draft a formal letter outlining concrete steps that the airline could take to address the issues Marcus had raised. The letter included requests for mandatory diversity training for all staff, a transparent and thorough review of hiring practices, and the implementation of an anonymous reporting system for employees to report discrimination without fear of retaliation. It was clear that a simple apology would not be enough. The airline needed to be held accountable, and the best way to do that was to ensure that their actions matched their words. Meanwhile, the pressure on the airline began to grow. News outlets picked up the story, with several high-profile commentators discussing the incident and its larger implications for the airline industry as a whole. It wasn't just Marcus anymore. This was a movement. People were beginning to understand that this wasn't about one bad experience. It was about a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to persist for far too long. The story of Marcus's mistreatment became a symbol of the broader struggle for equality and fairness in industries that had long been resistant to change. It was a stark reminder that even the most professional and prestigious companies had work to do when it came to diversity, inclusion, and addressing systemic bias. As the pressure mounted, the airline began to feel the weight of public opinion. Customers started posting on social media, boycotting the airline, and calling for boycotts of other companies in the industry with similar practices. The outcry was loud enough that the airline's leadership had no choice but to take stronger action. A few days later, Marcus received a call from the CEO of the airline. The CEO was apologetic and insisted that they were taking the matter seriously. The conversation was respectful, but Marcus could tell that they were now feeling the heat from all sides. The CEO promised that the airline would be implementing the changes Marcus and his colleagues had outlined in their letter, but Marcus wasn't satisfied yet. He wanted specifics. He wanted to know exactly what steps they would take, when they would take them, and how they would hold people accountable. The next few weeks were filled with meetings, phone calls, and endless paperwork. Marcus worked closely with the company's HR department, legal team, and diversity consultants to make sure that the changes they were pushing for were actually put into place. There was no room for compromise. If the airline truly wanted to change, they needed to show that they were committed to making those changes in tangible ways. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to see small but meaningful shifts. Diversity training sessions were scheduled for all employees, and there was talk of revising the company's hiring practices to ensure they were more inclusive and fair. It was clear that change was coming, but Marcus also knew that this was just the beginning. The road to real equality was long, and it would require ongoing effort from everyone involved. But he was willing to keep pushing, knowing that his actions had started something that couldn't be undone. As weeks turned into months, Marcus continued to monitor the progress the airline was making. The initial flurry of activity following the media coverage had faded a bit, but the change he had set in motion was far from over. Marcus had hoped for a quick fix, but he quickly realized that real change, the kind that would last, required more than just public statements or temporary adjustments. It would take commitment, consistency, and a willingness to challenge long-standing practices. The diversity training sessions had started. Marcus wasn't sure what to expect from them. He had heard about similar initiatives in other companies, and while some were effective, many fell short. Too often, they were little more than checkbox exercises, where employees were told about the importance of inclusivity, but not given the tools to make real, lasting changes. He was determined to make sure this wouldn't be the case here. He had been invited to sit in on a few of the training sessions, not as a participant, but as an observer. His presence was meant to lend weight to the process, showing that this was a serious issue, one that involved real people with real experiences. He could tell that the sessions weren't perfect. There was a palpable sense of discomfort in the room at times, especially when the discussion turned to issues of race and bias. People didn't like talking about these things. It made them uncomfortable. But that was the point. Change didn't happen by avoiding difficult conversations. It happened when people confronted their biases, acknowledged them, and worked to overcome them. The facilitators of the training were doing their best, but Marcus couldn't help but notice that some employees were disengaged. A few had their arms crossed or were visibly distracted. It was clear that they didn't see the relevance of the discussions or thought it was just another company initiative that would eventually fade into the background. Marcus knew that the success of these sessions didn't depend on how much information was provided. It depended on how willing the employees were to reflect on their own actions, to take responsibility for their part in maintaining a system that allowed discrimination to flourish. One particular training session stood out to him. It was a smaller group of managers, and Marcus had been asked to speak at the end. He wasn't sure what to expect. He had been asked to share his story, to talk about the experiences he had gone through, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be people in that room who had never experienced discrimination in the way he had. There would be people who couldn't understand why he had been so upset about what seemed like a small issue, and in a way, Marcus understood that. It wasn't their fault. They didn't know what it felt like to be overlooked, to be dismissed. But Marcus wasn't there to make them feel guilty. He was there to help them see, to help them understand that small actions and attitudes could have a huge impact. When he spoke, he wasn't angry or resentful. He simply shared his story, how he had been told to wait outside, how it had made him feel invisible, how he had spent years pushing to prove himself, only to find himself being treated as though he didn't belong. The room was quiet as he spoke. He didn't sugarcoat the experience, but he also didn't attack anyone. He simply told them what had happened, how it had affected him. and why it mattered. He could see that the managers in the room were paying attention, nodding as they processed his words. It wasn't a magic fix, but Marcus could see that his story was starting to have an impact. They were listening, and that, he realized, was the first step. Over the next few months, the airline made visible changes. They began to restructure their hiring processes to ensure a more diverse pool of candidates. They started implementing new systems to allow employees to report instances of discrimination or unfair treatment anonymously. And they brought in more outside experts to help with ongoing diversity and inclusion work. The company didn't just talk about wanting to change, it started taking real steps to make it happen. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still moments of resistance, especially among older employees who had worked at the airline for years and had never had to think critically about their behavior. There were still awkward conversations, still times when people avoided confronting the difficult truths that Marcus and others were pushing for. But he knew that these things didn't change overnight. Real change was messy. It took time. Marcus also knew that this wasn't just about changing the company. It was about changing the broader culture in the airline industry, a culture that had, for too long, allowed subtle and overt discrimination to thrive. The conversations happening at this airline were beginning to ripple out, slowly but surely, to other companies in the industry. Marcus had been contacted by other pilots, some from different airlines, who were interested in learning from what had happened. Some wanted to know how to implement similar changes in their own companies. Others wanted to share their own stories of discrimination. The movement Marcus had started had gained a life of its own. It was no longer just about his experience. It was about creating a safer, more inclusive industry for everyone. And though there were still plenty of challenges ahead, he couldn't help but feel hopeful. The conversations that had started were only the beginning. He had started something bigger than himself, and he knew that the momentum would continue to grow. At the end of the day, Marcus understood that change wasn't a quick fix. It was a process, a long and often uncomfortable one. But with each step forward, with each conversation, and each policy change, he was beginning to see the shift he had always hoped for. And though there was still so much more to be done, Marcus knew that he had made a lasting impact. He had stood up, spoken out, and created the space for change. That was something he would always be proud of. Months had passed since Marcus had made his stand, and although the public reaction had been strong at first, it was clear that the work was far from done. The airline had made progress. There was no denying that. New diversity initiatives were in place, and there had been a noticeable shift in the attitudes of many employees. But Marcus knew better than to think the battle was won. He had seen how often things were talked about, but never followed through. He was determined to stay vigilant, to ensure that the changes wouldn't be just surface-level changes that would eventually fade away. He continued to meet with the company's leadership regularly. There were still discussions about how to improve diversity training and refine hiring practices. In some ways, things were moving slowly, but that was part of the process. It took time to undo years of habits and assumptions that had been ingrained in the culture. Still, Marcus found himself growing increasingly hopeful. The fact that the conversation was happening at all, and that the company was showing some genuine effort to change, was something he hadn't expected just months before. Yet, there were moments that reminded him that change wasn't guaranteed. He'd hear stories from fellow colleagues who had been dismissed or treated unfairly in ways that mirrored his own experience. And although these stories didn't always come from his immediate circle, they were enough to remind him that the fight wasn't over. The industry as a whole needed to evolve, not just one company. It was at a company-wide meeting that Marcus realized just how far-reaching his impact had been. The airline's CEO, who had once been a passive observer of the situation, now spoke at the front of the room, addressing hundreds of employees. He praised the efforts of the company to create a more inclusive environment, but emphasized that the work was ongoing. What struck Marcus was the fact that the CEO had specifically mentioned the incident that had started everything, the one where Marcus had been told to wait outside. The CEO acknowledged it publicly, stating that the company had learned from the mistake and was working every day to ensure that no one ever felt that way again. It was an unexpected move, but one that gave Marcus a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about taking credit for what had been done. It was about making sure that the issue was acknowledged, and that everyone within the company knew that things had to change. Hearing the CEO talk about the incident made it clear that the company was starting to view the issue as part of its culture, not just an isolated incident. Marcus was invited to speak at that meeting as well. He hadn't expected it, but when the CEO mentioned him by name, he couldn't help but feel a bit overwhelmed. This was his moment, and he knew it. Standing at the front of the room, in front of hundreds of employees, Marcus shared his journey. He talked about his experience with the airline, his frustration, but also his hope. Hope that this moment wasn't just a blip on the radar. Hope that the steps the company was taking would be the beginning of something bigger, something that would influence the industry and perhaps set a new standard for the way people of all backgrounds were treated in the workforce. "I'm not standing here to say we fixed everything," Marcus said, his voice steady and clear. "What I'm saying is that we've started something. It's a small step, but it's a step forward. And that's all we can do. Take it one step at a time." His words resonated with many of the employees. Some were moved by his honesty, others were reflective, thinking about the implications of their own actions and attitudes. Marcus knew that the conversation wasn't easy for everyone, and it shouldn't be. This wasn't a problem that could be solved by a few words. It was going to take time, and it was going to take everyone's commitment to change. But seeing the acknowledgement from so many in the room made Marcus believe that the movement he had started would not fade into the background. As the meeting concluded, Marcus was approached by several colleagues. Some were fellow pilots, others were flight attendants and managers. They came up to thank him, not just for standing up that day, but for giving them a voice. He hadn't realized just how many people had been silently carrying the same frustrations and experiences. Some of them had never spoken out, either because they didn't feel it was their place or because they feared the consequences. But seeing Marcus take the first step had encouraged them to take their own steps toward change. "I've never been so inspired by someone," one of the flight attendants told him. "You made us realize that we don't have to just accept things as they are. We can make a difference." Marcus smiled, grateful for the recognition, but also humbled by the impact of his actions. He hadn't set out to be a leader. He had just wanted to be heard. But now, more than ever, he realized the power of simply speaking up. The next few months brought more changes. The company implemented more inclusive policies, and the diversity training continued. Marcus had made sure to keep checking in on the progress, meeting with team members, and helping to drive the conversations forward. There was still work to be done, but it was clear that things were changing in ways that couldn't be undone. Marcus felt a sense of quiet pride as he watched the company move forward. He didn't need to be at the center of it anymore. His story had been the catalyst, but now the work was continuing without him having to push it every step of the way. His involvement had sparked the conversation, but it was up to everyone involved to keep it alive. And though he knew the fight wasn't over, he understood that true change didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly with persistence, and it was worth every step. Marcus had learned that one person's actions, however small they seemed, could have a ripple effect that touched the lives of so many others. And as he looked to the future, he knew that the work was just beginning, not just for him, but for everyone who believed that things could be better. The months that followed were a testament to the quiet yet powerful ripple effect of Marcus's actions. He had never set out to be a trailblazer or a leader. He had simply wanted to be treated fairly, and when that fairness was denied, he had chosen to stand up. But in the weeks since his bold decision, Marcus had become an unexpected symbol of change. The conversation he had started within the airline had grown into something much larger than he could have imagined. The company, now publicly committed to its diversity initiatives, was pushing forward. Policies were being reevaluated, and hiring practices were being adjusted to reflect the values of inclusion and respect. But even more importantly, employees across the organization were beginning to change. Conversations that had once been uncomfortable or even avoided were now being had openly. There was a newfound awareness within the company, one that acknowledged that even the smallest gestures or words could have a lasting impact on someone's sense of belonging. Marcus had been invited to several more training sessions, but this time as a guest speaker, not just an observer. He was asked to share his experiences and discuss the broader issues facing people in the workplace who often felt overlooked or marginalized. Each time he spoke, he was met with a mix of curiosity and genuine interest from the staff. It wasn't easy for everyone, and Marcus knew it. But change was never easy. It was messy and uncomfortable, but it was happening, and that was what mattered most. In a meeting with the company's senior leadership, Marcus was again asked to provide input. The leaders had made progress, but they were eager to know if they were on the right track. What more could they do? What had they missed? This was the moment Marcus had been waiting for. The fact that they were asking him for advice, asking him how to improve, showed how far they had come. It was no longer about simply checking off boxes on a diversity checklist. It was about truly understanding what it meant to create an environment where everyone felt valued. "You've made real progress," Marcus said, leaning forward. "But you can't just stop here. The training, the changes to hiring, those are all important. But true change comes from the top down. It has to be part of the culture at every level. You need to hold people accountable, not just the employees, but the leaders. They set the tone. If they don't model the behavior we're talking about, the rest of the company won't either." The leadership team nodded in agreement. They had already begun discussing how they could integrate diversity into their core values, how to make it part of the company's mission. The work that Marcus had started had become ingrained in the very fabric of the organization, and although he wasn't the one driving the bus anymore, he could see the direction it was going. It was moving toward a future where respect for all was central, where every employee felt like they belonged, regardless of their background. Despite the company's efforts, Marcus knew that the journey wasn't over. The real challenge would always be sustaining the momentum. Change couldn't be a temporary phase. It had to be a continual process of reflection, growth, and improvement. He had seen enough organizations put up a good front for a few months, only to return to old habits once the pressure eased. But Marcus had faith that this company was different. He had seen the changes in people, seen how the employees were beginning to challenge their own biases and perceptions. That was where the real change started, not with policies, but with individuals. Still, Marcus remained vigilant. He didn't want the progress to be taken for granted. He stayed connected with his colleagues, with those who had been most affected by the changes, to ensure that no one felt left behind. He kept an eye on the company's practices, making sure that the promises were being upheld. It wasn't that he distrusted the company's efforts. It was that he understood how easy it could be to fall back into old patterns when the spotlight moved elsewhere. One afternoon, Marcus received an email from the airline's HR department, thanking him for his continued efforts in promoting diversity and inclusion within the company. The email included a note that the airline had been selected to receive an industry award for its work in advancing diversity in the workplace. The recognition was a huge step forward, and while it wasn't the goal Marcus had set out to achieve, it was a sign that the company's efforts were being noticed. It also validated the fact that he had been right to stand up when he did. His actions had played a role in creating a culture of change that others were now recognizing. The email was followed by a call from the senior leadership team, congratulating him on the recognition. They expressed how proud they were of the work that had been done, but more importantly, how proud they were of him for having the courage to speak out when it mattered most. As Marcus hung up the phone, a sense of satisfaction washed over him. This wasn't the end. He knew that. But it was a victory for everyone who had been dismissed, overlooked, or ignored. A victory for those who had never felt they had a voice, but now knew that if they spoke up, they could make a difference. Marcus had helped create a space where people felt empowered to advocate for themselves and others, where they didn't have to settle for being treated as less than. That night, As Marcus sat quietly in his apartment, he reflected on everything that had happened since that fateful day. He thought about the challenges he had faced, the frustration he had felt, but also the hope he had found along the way. In a world where change often seemed impossible, Marcus had proven that one person, with courage and conviction, could start a movement, and that movement could grow, one person at a time, until it became something that couldn't be ignored. The journey was far from over, but Marcus knew that he had made his mark. And as he looked forward to the future, he couldn't help but feel optimistic. Change was happening, slowly but surely, and he was proud to have played a part in it.